Hey guys, this is Ron. So in this video we're going to talk a little bit about reading and writing to or from files. So in this case we're going to use this text file here called access_log. So this is a log file that I pulled off the internet. It's just a sample to show you, some of the things that you can do with Python. So if I do a less on this AccessLog, what we'll find is there's a bunch of GET requests for different files on this web server, and then the web server puts its own code that it used. So a 200 basically says, hey, I found the file, everything's good to go. Well, we're concerned more about when it finds a 404. So that means a file was requested and that file does not exist. And so maybe that's going to point us in the direction of we have a link on our website that's old, and so it no longer points to the correct file, and so the file or the web server keeps returning a 404 indicating that that file can't be found. So we'll go ahead and check it out. We'll pull it into Python and we'll read from it and try to find those 404 entries. So if I type in Python, now notice I'm in the directory that the file is actually in. And so now I'm going to be able to access this file with just its file name. Understand though that if the file existed somewhere else in my operating system, then I would also have to specify the path to that file to ensure that Python can reach it. And so in most cases you're going to be writing some type of script, and maybe you'll schedule that, or you'll put it as some type of cron job. And so again, it's going to need to know the path to that file. So as a part of its name, you're going to specify the path. But in my case, I'm just going to specify AccessLog because I'm in the same directory. So we'll fire up Python, and again, we're just going to use the interpreter here because it's easier for you to see what's happening here rather than just writing it in a script. So the command that I'll use is open. So if I do a help on open, I'm going to have to specify the name of the file. And again, I'm local to it, so I'm just going to use the actual name. But I can also specify the mode and buffering. Now buffering we're not going to talk about because I've really had very little, if any, use for it. But mode you'll use all the time, depending upon if you're only reading from or also writing to. So by default, if you don't specify a mode, what you're going to get is read. So you are reading from the file, but you can specify whether you want to write to that file. And so write, what it's going to do is if that name of file doesn't exist, or if that file doesn't exist given the file name that you pass to it, it's going to create that file. If the file does exist, it's going to overwrite it. So just be careful of how you use write operations because you can lose data that way. Now additionally, you can use append. So append will create the file if it doesn't exist, but if it does exist, it's just going to write to the end of that file. And so it's a little bit of a safer operation to do, but again, it really depends on what type of operation you're kind of looking to perform. So we'll create a variable called f. I know it's not very descriptive, but for our purposes it will work. We'll do an open, we'll specify our file name. So access_log. And here we're going to specify the type of mode that we want. So in our case, we'll just do a read. Now I don't have to specify an R because it is the default, but for readability, it makes sense to put it in there. And so now if I do a dir on F, I've got a couple different things that I can do. So when we're all finished, we're going to go ahead and close the file. Now I'll show you an operation later that does this automatically for you, and so you don't have to remember to go ahead and close. There is a closed variable or an attribute here that you can access, and it'll basically let you know if this file's already closed or not. Okay. Now the main kind of methods here that we'll be looking at is read, readline, and read lines. Okay, and we'll also look a little bit at seek as well. When we finally get to the point where we want to output things to a file, we'll go ahead and do write. So for read, what read's going to do is read in the entire contents of the file. So if I do a help on f.read what we'll find is it will read the entire contents of the file all the way up to the end of file, and it will return one string, right? So the entire file will come to you as one string. And so maybe that's the functionality you want. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in our scenario to do it that way because we want to deal with them on a line-by-line basis so that anytime we find 404 within that line, we can take that and output it to a file. But just so you can see, we can do a content equals f.read. And so now our content is a type string. If I look at how big of a file it is, it has 174,449 characters, right? Or, you know, you have some new lines and some, you know, other things like that in there, but essentially we're talking about one enormous string. And so we could print that string, but again, because we're treating it all as one big item, it's a little bit hard to deal with, let's say, just this line. Now we could perform some operations to split these out and do different things, but in our case it doesn't make much sense to do so because there are better ways of reading in the file and have it kind of formatted the way we want it already. So if I go back to F here, I have executed read. Now I want to check out read, not read into, Readline. Okay, so if I do an f.readline, in this case I'm not going to get anything in return. So notice I didn't get anything back, and that's because with my read I read all the way to the end of the file, and so my position within that file, I'm sitting at the very end. There's nothing left to read from, which is why I don't get anything in return. So to go back to the top, I can do seek, and seek allows me to specify a position within the file to go to. So I'll do an f.seek, and I'm just going to specify 0. So I'm basically telling it I want to start at the very beginning. So if I arrow up and go back to f.readline, I will get a single line back. And so this is a little bit closer to what I want. It's a little bit closer to the functionality. Now I'm able to deal with individual lines. I can look to see if there's a 404 in here, and if so, I'm going to capture this line. Now I could certainly do a for loop. I could do something like for line in f.readline and iterate over the entire file one by one, and then check this line to see if it has this 404 in it. So I could certainly do that. In this case, I'm not going to. I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I'm going to do an f.readlines. And the reason I'm going to do that, and I'll show you here, if I do a help on f.readlines, instead of getting back individual lines, I'm going to get back every single line, but I'm building a list of that. So instead of getting a string back, I'm going to get a list of strings of each line. So if I do f.seek to go back to the beginning of the file, and then I do a content equals f.readlines, now when I look at the type, I have a type of list. And so if I wanted the first line again, I can address it just like it's a list, because, well, that's what it is, right? And so now I have the first line, I have the second line, so on and so forth, right? If I do a len on content, I have 1,546 lines that I'm going to have to iterate over. But now I have one object that contains all of my entries, and that I can work with it that way. So at this point, I no longer need my AccessLog file, so I can do an f.close, and I'm good to go there. So now I have a couple different options. How do I want to iterate over this list in order to find those 404s? So I could certainly do a for loop. For line in content, if 404 in line, print that line. And so what I get back is just the entries within that file that have a space 404 space, right? So anytime there was a 404 returned, those are the lines that I care about, right? So out of these 1,546 lines, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. Now understand though, each of these lines has a /n. Print also adds its own carriage return or new line. And so I end up with blank spaces in between them. But in my case, I don't really care because I'm not looking to print it. I'm looking to write it to a file. So this is one method for getting that data out of content. But what if I wanted to save that data in another, let's say, list? So now I have a much smaller list that only has what I wanted. So I could create a list and then do maybe this new list .append and append the line to it. More than likely, for me, I tend to use what's called a list comprehension. And it looks a little odd, but once you get used to the way that they're written, they're very powerful because they're very efficient, very fast. And so if you're having to iterate over a very large data set, so this was only 1,500 lines, but let's imagine we're talking thousands or hundreds of thousands of lines. There's a good speed gain, an efficiency gain by doing so with a list comprehension rather than a loop like this. And so what that's going to look like is we'll do a content2 equals, we'll put brackets for a list, and we'll do a line for line in content if 404 in line. And I forgot my quote there. Boom. All right. So what this says, and again, it looks a little odd if you've never seen one before. This looks very much like this, right? So this is just a for loop. All right. So it's a for loop inside of this list. And so for every entry within content, one by one, they get peeled out into line. And then furthermore, they get peeled out into this line over here. And so we could perform some type of operation, and you usually see it that way as well. So maybe I wanted to strip off the new line characters that I know exist here. So I could do a line.strip here. I could do maybe a line.lower, so everything goes to lowercase. You know, there's any number of things that I could do here, depending upon what you want. So again, we just have a normal for loop here. We have some type of operation happening on whatever comes out of here. And then we have some type of test condition. So this again looks exactly like this. So we've basically replicated our for loop inside of this list. And we call this a list comprehension. And this, amazingly, is a whole lot faster than doing this. It just is. So now what I have in content2 is 5 entries. So I have 5 lines within content2. Okay, so I only have these items within content2. And so now I can do whatever I want to that. In my case, I'm just going to create a new file. We'll call this new file 404_log. And in this case, we're going to open it for write, if I could type today. So it created 404.log, and now we have the ability to write to it. For line in content2, we are going to new file.write. We'll put the line in there. And again, I could have done this very well with that up there, but maybe there's further things I wanted to do with it. So again, I created a new list with just those entries, and I could have done something, worked with the data a little bit more before outputting it. Either way, I have now written those entries to the file. So now it's time to close the file. So new file dot close. So my data has been written to that file. That file has been closed. If I go to my tab here, I have this 404 log now, and that contains my 5 entries. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. And so I opened it for read or for write. If I were to open it again for write, I'm going to lose this data that's in it. But if I were to open it with an A for append, those additional entries would just be below these entries that I made. Okay? So that's how you read from a file. You can write to the file. I even showed you a little bit of list comprehensions because that's typically how I iterate through some of these entries. But one thing I'd like to show you before we wrap up is, how do you open a file up and then not have to close it? So you might see in other people's code this happening, and to me this is typically how I do it because I'll forget. If I'm just opening it for read, eventually I'll forget to close it. So I can do with open access_log. Again, you don't have to specify R for read. We'll do it as F, and then content equals f.read lines. Boom. So if I do f.closed, I get a true back because F is closed. So it opened it only long enough to perform this operation. As soon as this code block was done, it went ahead and closed the file. And so again, you might see this. If people are just trying to read from it quickly, they don't need anything else from the file. You'll typically see this because then they save a line of code without having to close the file. They don't have to worry about it. None of that kind of stuff. So I hope you found that helpful. Again, that's reading from files, that's writing to files. Remember, if you write and the file exists, you're going to overwrite it. If you're trying to keep that data, it's better to do an append. And then in order to move through large data sets like this, I would recommend that you get used to using list comprehensions because, again, it's much more efficient than doing a bunch of for loops. So hope again that was helpful for you, and thank you for watching.